If you can keep your ketone level, we use the one millimole per microliter. That's a pretty good level that will allow your brain to use that. And remember, when you burn glucose, it's more inflammatory. So when you're burning just glucose all the time, that's going to cause inflammation in the heart, which causes coronary artery disease and so on. When we get them keto adapted, and this is just totally an artifact, but their hearts disappeared. So you go, oh my God, like their hearts are no longer using glucose. They're now burning ketones and fats, right? Because they're fat adapted, so they're burning fats. So that's why their triglyceride drops. That's why your fat content of your tissue drops. And your heart would much rather burn ketones and fats than sugars. But if all you're feeding it all the time is sugar, that's the fuel it's going to use, right? So the brain and the heart both super benefiting by the presence of those ketones.
And the brain and the heart, what are they most needed for? Survival.
People are keto adapted. There's this extra 250 calories that they're burning every day relative to other people at basal metabolic rate, and that's exactly the amount that the gluconeogenesis would consume. So,
Dr. David Harper, welcome to the Keto Camp podcast, my friend.
Wow, glad to be here, Ben. And we talked over the years about doing this, so it's great to be on your show finally. I just want to thank you for doing this, for doing the hard work and spending the time to get the right information out to the general public. It's such a service because there's so much noise out there, on the internet and social media, and your show provides really good science-based, evidence-based information that will help people live happier, healthier lives. So I really want to thank you for that off the top.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that acknowledgement, and the work you're doing is amazing. This is going to be such a valuable conversation for the keto campers who are listening and watching. I'm super excited for them. So those who are tuning in right now, you chose the right episode. This is going to be, I believe, life-changing information for you and the people you share it with. And so for those who don't know, me and David, we first met in person just a couple of months ago at Keto Salt Lake in Salt Lake City, Utah. I was blessed to share the stage with David and so many other incredible speakers. As a matter of fact, you were right on after me. And I remember coming off the stage, you giving me a fist pump, and then you hitting the stage and me watching you in action. And you gave such a brilliant lecture. And we'll extract some of those nuggets from that lecture and some of the studies you've been doing. But I want to start actually with the quote that I heard you share before, and then we'll get into your backstory. So here's the quote. It's an ancient Ayurvedic proverb. When diet is wrong, medicine is of no use. When diet is correct, medicine is of no need. What does that quote mean to you, David?
Yeah, it kind of sums up a movement amongst clinicians and researchers. I'm part of a group in Canada. I'm here in Vancouver called the Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition. And it's sort of a food first approach to chronic disease. If we can improve people's health significantly, and I think we can actually, through diet, decrease your risk of chronic disease by about 70% in kind of a back of the envelope calculation. So why wouldn't you do that first before you start, giving people drugs and cutting off bits of their body and, stapling stomachs and things like that? Why wouldn't you try, the natural solution, which is food first? So that's what it tells me. If you get the food right, if you get the fuel right, a lot of those other things will correct themselves. I know you've experienced that, and I've experienced that. In the people that we counsel and at your keto camp and the people in our clinical studies, we don't always get the same results with everybody all the time, but one result we always get is everybody just feels better when they've adopted a well-formulated ketogenic diet. So yeah, I think I am an advocate, I'm a scientist, but I had my own sort of aha moment. And now I'm trying to get as many people out there to hear that message that they should try it. It's not necessarily for everyone, but why wouldn't you try a method that doesn't include putting drugs into your body or having other huge lifestyle changing events? You just change your diet, and it's a happier, healthier diet too. It tastes better and it's more satisfying. And but 100% of the people I've counseled over the last 10, 12 years, they say they feel great. So if that's all you get out of it, you're already ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a bold statement. I mean, for those who missed it, you said you believe if you change your nutrition, change your diet to a healthy diet, it could be a ketogenic diet, you could reduce your risk, prevent disease by about 70% is what you said, just from diet alone. And that's probably a conservative number right there. And And you're
No,
saying,
yeah, I think it's probably. I mean, if you look at, so I have this model in my book, Bio Diet, and I call it the axis of illness. It's kind of a takeoff on George Bush one's axis of evil. So
yeah, it's
the
perfect.
axis of illness, are the three things that we do have a ton of scientific evidence to show they're at the root cause of most chronic disease. When we talk about chronic disease, Ben, we're talking about cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, those sort of metabolic related conditions. And the three factors there that you can look in the research yourself. What percent of diseases are related to obesity, insulin resistance, or inflammation? And that number 70% just keeps popping up. And so what a ketogenic diet does is address all three of those. The insulin resistance, we can talk about that. Everybody kind of knows what obesity is. And then inflammation, we're talking about chronic systemic inflammation. If you can address those three things, anybody in the allied health services will tell you that you're going to have a huge impact on the incidence and severity of chronic disease. So yeah, no, I think it's a good back of the envelope number to work with.
Yeah, it's very hopeful. I love that. Well, we're going to dive deep into the three areas of that triangle. Before we do that, and before we get into some other cool things, I mean, I know your backstory, and you lost your mom to breast cancer. So maybe you could share growing up, going back there with your mom getting sick. And how old were you? And was that the inspiration to really start to research cancer and the development of cancer in our population?
Yeah. Yeah, I sort of came into the cancer research end of this a bit later. So in my academic career, so my background is in mathematical biofluid dynamics, and I've been teaching anatomy, physiology, and pathology in health for almost 40 years now.
Wow.
At the university level. And so yeah, my mom died when I was 9, just turning 10. She'd had breast cancer. We would now, I'm guessing it was probably what we would now call triple negative breast cancer. They didn't have those tests in those days in the 60s. And so she was all sick while I was growing up. We were kind of the classic Protestant family. We didn't really talk about it, but I mean, that affects you when you're a kid, and your mom dies when you're 9, and the rest of the family kind of pulls together. And so I've always been interested in health and healthcare. And so it is kind of nice that at the end of towards the end, I'm not finished yet, towards the end of my academic career, that I'm now, addressing the very disease that took my mother's life when I was a child. And so that to me is just rewarding, and we're having a positive impact. And we should say off the top, it's not a cure for cancer, Ben. Like we're having positive clinical effects that we can measure. But I don't want people to go away from this saying, hey, I saw, Ben and Dave talking about keto and cancer and it's a cure. It's not. We've had some very good results, but it would all be considered emerging science at this point. And the sample sizes are small, but the results are good, and we can get into that.
Would you say that the best cure for cancer is prevention?
Yeah, that's what people ask me. So I finished now, but I was a visiting scientist at the British Columbia Cancer Research Center, which is one of the world's leading comprehensive cancer research centers here in Vancouver. And that's where we did our work. We were doing immunohistochemistry on blood samples from the patient population with Dr. Jeff Volek's group at The Ohio State University. So that's what we did. And so because I work at a place like that, people often ask me, what's the best treatment for cancer or whatever. And it's really like, just don't get it in the first place. Yeah. Because once you get it, we have treatments and they're getting better and better, but it's way easier to just not get it. And I think the other thing, Ben, the other sort of bit of good news we have to get at people is, I think, as the aging population, my age group and so on, I think people are resigned to the fact that when you age, when you're 50 and up, 60 and up, you just get heavy and you get sick and you need drugs and you need operations. You don't. Like, you're getting those largely because you've been eating a diet that was causing those conditions to progress. Mm-hmm. And the really great news that we can deliver today is that by reversing, by changing that diet, by eliminating the sugars and high refined carbohydrates, you can actually reverse most of those disease conditions, and quickly. I mean, we've seen people, that have been diabetic on insulin for a decade, and 6 weeks into a well-formulated ketogenic diet, they don't need any medication anymore, and their insulin resistance is back to normal, and so yeah, we're finding now it's reversible. Even some of the cardiovascular disease, the atherosclerosis, it's reversible if you can limit that inflammation that causes that. So It's
Yeah.
all very exciting and very promising. And so it's one thing I like about the community, the keto community, is we're supportive of each other as we're doing today. But we're very much interested in evidence-based results and not hype. So what we're presenting to you is the science, and I can get as geeky as you want to get on the science, right down to the cellular molecular level. That's the level at which it's being studied by some of the best researchers at some of the best universities and research centers all over the world right now. So it is not a fad diet. It's for real. It's here to stay, and you can really improve your life if you want to adopt a well-formulated ketogenic diet, and your keto camp is a great way to get started.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, it's a metabolic process. There's nothing new about keto. To your point, it's been around for as long as humans have existed, and what we essentially have is a keto deficiency. Not enough people are tapping into this amazing process. So what you do with your book, Bio Diet, and your work and episodes, conversations like this, it helps people become aware that it's not just a fad weight loss tool. It's actually an amazing process that does so much more than help you lose weight. The weight loss is a side effect of your body and your metabolism starting to repair itself. Your triangle in your book, obesity, insulin resistance, and inflammation. So let's talk about how keto tackles all three of those areas.
Sure. Okay. Well, I guess first there's a recent paper by David Ludwig and others, including my colleagues Jeff Bullock and others, and it was the old model of that calories in, calories out view, if we start with the obesity, is kind of pretty much been disproven at this point, I would say. I don't think they in that paper, they've looked very hard. It was out in the fall in the Journal of American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Ludwig et al. We can probably put the name of the paper in your liner notes there for people who want to see it. It's very approachable and readable. But they basically look at the 4 or 5 arguments that would say that a calorie balance, calorie surplus causes obesity. And so you have to, it's calories in, calories out. It's dieting and exercise. And it turns out that model just doesn't work. There just isn't any scientific, in fact, the evidence points to, what we call the carbohydrate insulin model. Yeah. So that obesity, for most people, obesity is a result of chronic exposure to a high carbohydrate diet, especially a high glycemic index carbohydrate, those fast absorbable sugars that you get in from sugar, but also starches and breads, pasta, rice, that sort of thing. All of that elevates your blood sugar level dramatically, and our natural body response is to secrete insulin. And so insulin's a good thing. It's probably the most powerful hormone that we have circulating. It does a lot of different things, stimulates protein synthesis. We usually think of it as absorbing, sugar from the blood into the cells, especially fat cells, liver cells, muscle cells, to be used as a fuel. But insulin, depending on how much insulin is in the system, can also bias your system towards storing sugar as fat rather than burning it in the cells. And so there's a condition called hyperinsulinemia, which is too much insulin in the blood. And that would be absolutely, there's no question, stimulated by a diet chronically high in carbohydrate. So now you have a lot of blood sugar and you have a lot of insulin in your system, and those two things will promote obesity. There's no question of that. And
would you say a diet that's naturally high, well, I shouldn't say naturally, but that is high in carbohydrates, what goes along with it is that you're constantly eating throughout the day, which could contribute to the problem as well?
Yeah, you get a hunger. There's 2 other hormones, leptin and ghrelin, that, ghrelin's kind of the go button, makes you want to eat, and leptin is the satiety button that makes you stop eating. So those get affected too by that high carb diet. But also, when you eat a lot of carbs and you secrete a lot of insulin, the insulin takes, because there's more insulin than you really should have in there, it takes out more carbs than you really want to take out. And when your carbs are low, that's when you get hungry. And so that's one of the things that affects the hypothalamus and creates that sense of hunger, and you want to eat. And what you probably want to eat at that time is something starchy, because your body's saying, I need some blood sugar, I need something starchy, I need some sugar. And so you get it. It's the classic thing, people, the standard American breakfast. I like standard American diet, SAD, because it's sad.
So sad.
People think this is healthy. I'll get up, I'll have some cereal with orange juice and toast and all that stuff, and yogurt, whatever. It's all just loaded with carbohydrates and sugar. Mm-hmm. So they have this huge boost of sugar, which causes a huge insulin rush. And then what happens at like 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning is you're starving because that excess of insulin has pulled all excess sugar out of your blood, and now you're hungry again. So you just get in that cycle. And there have been studies, we've known this for more than a decade, about 15 years, that kind of eating, the standard American diet, it just keeps your insulin levels way higher than it should be all the time. And that is an abnormal state. It's homeostasis is broken down. You've forced your body into a state it doesn't want to be in. And so anytime you're out of homeostasis, out of that balance, you're going to get an illness. So what I consider those three factors, the insulin resistance, the obesity, and inflammation, not only are they all three independent factors that cause chronic disease, but they all make each other worse, right? So obesity makes insulin resistance worse. It makes inflammation worse. Inflammation makes the other two worse, and so on. And so you get this vicious cycle, and eventually, it sort of spins off as a chronic disease when it's defined. As soon as your blood sugar's at this point, then they say, okay, now you're pre-diabetic. At this point, now you're diabetic. So it's a number they're looking at, right? And so you get to the point where you have a chronic. I actually think all of those chronic diseases are different manifestations of the same thing that's happening at the mitochondrial level. And I know just a week or two ago, you just had a great show on looking at mitochondrial function and dysfunction.
Yeah.
The mitochondria are the little organelles within the cells that are responsible for energy conversion. And they have a little bit of their own DNA. They reproduce inside your cells and so on. So healthy mitochondria, healthy metabolic state, right? Unhealthy metabolic state, unhealthy mitochondria. So what we really want to do is get those mitochondria in optimal shape, and reproducing quickly, and exercise is a fantastic thing for that, but diet can do it as well. And so that's really kind of the way I view chronic disease. I presented that model all over the world to researchers and scientists and physicians and clinicians, and everybody goes, that's pretty much the way it works. So I like to give people simple models, right? And in that model, obesity, you can measure that. I don't need to tell people how to do that, but it's in BioDiet if you want. Insulin resistance can be measured pretty easily. There's something called HOMA-IR, which is the homeostatic model assessment, which you can calculate if you measure your insulin levels in the blood. So you'd need to do a clinical blood test, but you can calculate your insulin resistance, or your physician can do it for you. And then inflammation, that's one that you generally hurt. You aches and pains all over your body. And people say, "Oh, I'm getting older. I hurt all the time." You don't have to, but it is a sign that you're chronically inflamed. And that inflammation, by the way, is at the root cause of most cardiovascular disease, which causes heart attacks and stroke. They're not caused by fat in your diet or cholesterol in your diet. We know that now. It's caused by inflammation. That's the root cause. And so we need to control that inflammation in the system. And eating sugar and high glycemic index carbohydrates is highly inflammatory. Eating vegetable oils, I know you're a big one on, other than say olive oil or avocado oil, but those crappy vegetable oils, super high in omega-6, super inflammatory. So, and I think you presented a great slide at your presentation in Salt Lake City, saying, if you're going to smoke a pack of cigarettes, correct me if I'm paraphrasing here, for like 20 years, what's your risk of lung cancer? It's maybe 25%. If you're going to eat really crappy, highly inflammatory, like canola oil and all those other vegetable oils for 20 years, what's your likelihood of cardiovascular disease? And it's like 100%. Like you are. So so it's no wonder we have all these problems. And all those diseases, if you look at diabetes, look at obesity, which itself is a disease, there are comorbidities. So if you have obesity, you're way more likely to be diabetic. If you're diabetic, you're way more likely to have Alzheimer's. Either of those, you're way more likely to have cardiovascular disease. So to me, the diseases can have their own names and treatments, but the root cause is the metabolism at the cellular molecular level, right down at the mitochondrial level. Mm-hmm. So, and you can make your mitochondria healthier through diet and exercise.
Yeah, exactly. What a great explanation. That triangle, it's very important to understand that. So for those watching or listening, you might want to rewind it a little bit and unpack that a second time. It's obesity, insulin resistance, and inflammation. And we're talking about chronic inflammation, not acute inflammation from a sprained ankle or something like that.
That's right, yeah.
And when we think about obesity, right, and we think about what causes us to gain weight, of course, it's insulin and insulin in excess. And carbohydrates will produce the most insulin response from that pancreas. Of course, processed carbs will do it more than whole food carbs, complex carbs, but it's still a problem when you eat it in excess. And the average American is eating about over 300 grams of carbs per day and eating it frequently. So ketosis, the ketogenic diet, of course, you're eating more fat, less carbohydrates. You're naturally lowering insulin, which is going to help with the insulin resistance part. So that right there is taken care of. Now, the inflammation part, I want to focus on the mitochondria level. How do ketones communicate with the mitochondria? How do ketones lower free radicals, reactive oxygen species? How does ketosis lower inflammation in the body?
It's a really good question, because there's two angles we can look at. So this is going to get a bit geeky for those folks a little bit into this cellular molecular biology. So
yeah, geeky.
Yeah. So well, when we're talking about ketones, actually, they're ketone bodies, right? Because ketone is like acetone. So ketones are produced when you metabolize fats, as opposed to metabolizing sugars. You produce ketones, and the ketone that's produced initially is mostly acetoacetate. And that's the one that's measured in those breath ketone meter things, if you've seen those.
Acetoacetate, isn't that in the urine, acetone in the breath?
Sorry, yes, you're correct.
Yeah.
Sorry, the acetoacetate is the urine test, the strip
Correct.
test. Yeah, sorry, it's the acetone you get in your breath. I got that mixed up. But what you really want to measure is the beta hydroxybutyrate. That's the beneficial ketone that's in your blood. And you really have to do a blood prick, like a glucose monitor type. That's what we do in our clinical studies to get an accurate measure of that. So it does two things. One is in cells, there's something called the NLRP3 inflammasome, the NOD-like receptor protein 3 inflammasome. So it's basically, if you look at a picture of inflammation within the cell, that molecule is right at the middle of it, and it sparks the inflammation within the cell. So we think of inflammation as, swelling and redness and heat and those classic things, but it happens at the cellular level too. It's very damaging. It affects the DNA in a negative way. It affects the mitochondria in a negative way. So one of the things that we know that beta hydroxybutyrate does, which is the main ketone produced when you're in ketosis, is it down-regulates NLRP3. That means it reduces the amount of that within the cells. So that's a great way. Also, when you switch to fat metabolism, when that's being metabolized in the mitochondria, it actually triggers more of the antioxidant reactions within the cell. And oxidants cause damage. Oxygen cause, kind of think of like, when you cut an apple or iron rusting, that's oxidation. And that kind of thing is happening. You're getting kind of rusting happening in your DNA and in your cells if you have too much oxidants. And when you're burning glucose, it's very oxidative. When you switch to what we call beta oxidation by fat production, you produce more of the antioxidants within the cell to help reduce that inflammation. So right at the cellular level, you get that change. Now you can, when you go and get your blood work done for your physical, ask them to do a test called HSCRP, which is high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And this is the best good measure of your overall state of chronic inflammation. So you want that number to be low. If you've just had a flu or cold or something, don't do it then, because you will be inflamed naturally.
Or an injury or surgery, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the natural innate immune response. Yeah, surgery, any of those sorts of things, injuries. So, but otherwise, that's the best measure for that, and that will give you a starting point, a benchmark that you can measure against. And when we measure HSCRP in people that have been on ketogenic diets, it drops dramatically. The only other thing that drops is triglycerides.
Do you want to see it under 1.5? Like, what is an optimal range that you want to see?
Yeah, there's a bit of a problem there, because Canadians and Americans measure things in different units.
I'm thinking with my American mind there, yeah.
Yeah, so they'll give you a range
okay.
Where it should be, and generally lower is better for CRP. Okay. You don't want to necessarily be zero, but lower is better. And if it's high, your physician will notice that. That will tell you you're in a state of inflammation, which means something's not right in your system. And that will lead to erosion of your arteries, and that sparks the atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis, and that causes heart attacks and strokes. And so you want to limit that. Also, inflammation is generally you want inflammation in the short term, protect yourself from injury and infection, that sort of thing. But long term, it interferes with all the normal healthy cellular processes of regeneration, repair, and that sort of thing. So you need to dampen that, and ketones do that directly. And the other thing they do is at the cellular level, they upregulate something called AMPK, AMP kinase, which is the molecule that is elevated when you exercise aerobically. And that has all of the downstream positive effects of that aerobic exercise are run through AMPK. So it's the sort of central molecule in the same way that the NLRP3 is the central molecule for inflammation. the AMPK is the central one for all the benefits you get from exercise. And that's upregulated by beta hydroxybutyrate as well, which is interesting in that, in a way, and I think people should exercise, and I'll say why in a second. In a way, you get many of the benefits of exercise from a ketogenic diet without the exercise.
Right. Yeah.
Now, the reason you should exercise is there's no question the best way to cause so there's a lot of talk of autophagy, cells turning over with intermittent fasting and so on. So there's more important than that, Ben, is mitophagy, is the rapid turnover of healthy new, like producing new baby, happy, healthy mitochondria. And so that mitophagy, the best way to stimulate mitophagy, exercise, right? So you still need to exercise, but now you're getting double the bonus of that AMPK activity. And the third thing that happens at the cellular level with that ketone, beta hydroxybutyrate, is you get a downregulation of something called mTOR, which is the mammalian target of rapamycin. And that's a huge black box of about, for your listeners, your viewers, just go ahead and Google mTOR, like MTOR, and you'll see it's like 200 different functions at the cellular level. Most of them are growth promoters. Yeah. Now, you do want to have that, but you don't want to have it uncontrolled, which happens when you're inflamed, you're on a high carb diet, and you get that inflammation, you upregulate mTOR. A ketogenic diet downregulates it to its normal level in the same way it downregulates the insulin secretion to its normal level. That prevents excessive growth of tissues, which is what happens when you have cancer. You have unregulated excessive growth of abnormal tissues. So that's, again, some of the mechanisms by which ketones themselves have great benefit at the cellular molecular level.
Such a great explanation. If somebody's thinking about doing keto and they're watching this or listening, they are so excited to get started with it. I mean, you just explain the scientific benefit, the cellular process of what ketones do. And those are just a few. There's many more. And that's why, for example, when people are following a ketogenic lifestyle, they feel so much better. Their cells, their mitochondria are producing more energy. And if you look at just the electron transport chain, you could actually see that the ATP, which is that energy gasoline of that mitochondria, there's about a 400% increase in ATP when a mitochondria is using ketones versus glucose, right? 32 to 36 ATP glucose molecule and over 120 with the ketone molecule. And that's because of this mitogenesis.
Equal mass. Yeah, equal mass, because the ketones are very small. So not molecule by molecule, but equal mass. Yeah. No, and your brain prefers it. Yeah. So your brain, now, I think most people, or a lot of people would know, there's an extra protective layer in your brain called the blood-brain barrier, and you need special carriers to get things to protect the brain from anything that might be circulating in your blood that could cause harm. And so glucose, there's special glucose receptors, a special type of, they're called GLUT, G-L-U-T, transporters that help to get that glucose in. And you don't need insulin to get that in your brain. You need insulin to get that into the glucose into your fat cells and muscle cells, but not your brain, because your brain likes to burn glucose. Your brain can't burn fats. It can't burn proteins like your other tissues can. It can burn glucose, and for a long time, as a kid, when we did our physiology, we said, no, the brain can only burn glucose. Therefore, you have to consume 150 grams of glucose a day or your brain will shut off.
People still believe that, by the way.
Yeah, I know they do. Oh, I know. Oh, I have people that should know better. No, you can actually replace that with beta hydroxybutyrate, and there's it's called an MCT transport. Now, it's not the MCT medium chain triglyceride. This is the transporter for the ketone that gets beta hydroxybutyrate into the brain cells. And if that's available, your brain will choose that first. Why? Because it produces more ATP with less oxidative stress, less inflammation, and Alzheimer's disease is an inflammatory disease. So again, you're reducing inflammation in the brain. How will you know that? And you would have seen this in the people that you counsel, is people that have, brain fog, they're getting older, because a lot of the people we counsel are, they're overweight, they're obese, they're middle-aged. And they're getting brain fog, and they think, oh, it's just part of the aging process, mild cognitive impairment or whatever. No, it's probably happening as your brain's getting inflamed, and that inflammation helps to, promote Alzheimer's, like, dementia and that sort of thing. So the beta hydroxybutyrate is anti-inflammatory in the brain. And then it allows the insulin that is needed in the brain to kind of get the fuel to be burned properly. It works better with that insulin. And so what my friends call it the Harper high, right? Because I think, wow, I experienced that, 12 years ago or whatever it was when I keto adapted. It was like I felt crappy. I had that keto flu. We have ways of alleviating that now that we've learned about, but then, like, I think about a week or so into it, I woke up one day and it was fantastic, right? I just felt great. And one of the women that I was counseling, she came into my office one day and she said, "I just want to thank you." And I go, "Sure, what have I done?" And she said, "It's like you pulled cotton wool out of my brain." She said, "I've had brain fog for like a decade, and I woke up and all of a sudden I had this clarity that I haven't had since I was a teenager."
Wow.
And I thought, wow, that doesn't happen with everybody, but that tells you that something profound and good is happening in your brain.
Yeah, I've heard so many similar shares like that from my students. It just turns the brain on. And there's a lot of confusion because people think the brain needs glucose 24/7, and it does. I mean, if your body is in ketosis, there's only a certain percentage. What is the percentage that it could use for ketones? Is it about 70% BHB or?
Yeah, Cahill did some studies on that back in the 60s, starvation studies. The best source for the effects of ketones in the brain is Dr. Stephen Cunnane, Cunnane. He's at University of Sherbrooke, a friend of mine. And he's doing the seminal work on mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's, and using ketogenic diets there. So yeah, in some of those extreme studies, these are extreme studies of starvation. You can get up to 70-80% of that fuel by the ketones that are produced, but you don't really want to be there.
Yeah.
What you do is, half and half's kind of nice. If you can keep your ketone level, we use the one millimole per microliter. That's a pretty good level that will allow your brain to use that. The other organ that uses it, and we've seen this in some of our cancer research studies, because we use something called fluorodeoxyglucose to image our patients, to image tumors. And so fluorodeoxyglucose, you take an oxygen off, you stick a fluoride on, and it's radioactive, so we can make it shows up on the imaging. So it's basically a glucose molecule. So you can watch where glucose is going. And because something called a Warburg effect, cancer cells love glucose. They're totally dependent on it. They can't do that oxidative respiration, that electron transport chain you talked about. So they're totally dependent on anaerobic respiration and glucose. So that's how we image tumors, is we give them this radioactive glucose, and it goes into the tumors at about 100 to 200 fold, and they show up. But so we're seeing that with our patients, at the beginning of the studies, you can see the heart at the beginning of the studies before they're keto adapted, and it's glowing black too. It turns out black on these images because it's really using that glucose. And remember, when you burn glucose, it's more inflammatory. Mm-hmm. So when you're burning just glucose all the time, that's going to cause inflammation in the heart, which causes coronary artery disease and so on. When we get them keto adapted, and this is just totally an artifact, but their hearts disappeared. So you go, oh my God, like their hearts are no longer using glucose. They're now burning ketones and fats, right? Because they're fat adapted, so they're burning fats. So that's why their triglyceride drops. That's why your fat content of your tissue drops. And your heart would much rather burn ketones and fats than sugars. But if all you're feeding it all the time is sugar, that's the fuel it's going to use, right? So
that is so cool. That
is
very,
cool.
very cool.
There you go. The brain and the heart both super benefiting by the presence of those ketones.
And the brain and the heart, what are they most needed for? Survival. Most metabolically demanding organs that have the highest concentration of mitochondria. It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Now, here's something that I want you to answer. People say the brain, you do need glucose, right? Even if you're in ketosis, like, where are you getting the glucose from? But they don't understand. Some people don't understand. You don't have to eat that glucose. So how is glucose created in the body if you're not actually eating carbohydrates?
Right. So when we can talk about the source of ketones too, you can take ketones exogenously through products they have now. So you do need glucose in your blood, right? And so, and again, the numbers we use are a bit different. But you can use the 100 or whatever, I think is the one they use in the States, is sort of is that a good level? 100?
Yeah, 80 milligrams per deciliters, I would consider an optimal fasted glucose blood.
Okay, so you want 80. So you can eat carbohydrate all the time, and it'll elevate and come back down, but hopefully it'll stay at that 80 level at least when you're fasting. Now, if you don't eat carbohydrates. And let's remember that humans evolved not eating carbohydrates. We didn't evolve with pizza and cornflakes and that sort of thing. We evolved eating like fish and meat and stuff and a little bit of vegetables and berries, but mostly animal fats, fats first, right? So if you don't eat it, there's a pathway, a mechanism in your liver called gluconeogenesis, which literally means making new glucose. And that's where your liver cells create glucose as needed from non-sugar sources. So it can use the glycerol part of it, triglyceride, amino acids are used as well. And it'll do that. And by the way, the amount of sugar that you need in your blood at any point in time is about a teaspoonful.
Yeah. So
it's not very much. And your liver can very happily do that. And not only is it happy to do that, because that's what, you think of cats and dogs and stuff that eat meat all the time, they still need to have sugar in their blood. That's how they're doing it. And that's how humans do it as well. Right. That's the natural state, right? And that's what we do at night. And, we produce that sugar as needed. So the gluconeogenesis is triggered, but also that burns about an extra 250 calories a day to produce that. So we've done all these studies to show that people who are keto adapted, there's this extra 250 calories that they're burning every day relative to, other people at basal metabolic rate. And that's exactly the amount that the gluconeogenesis would consume. So yeah, you don't need to consume it. There are essential fats and fatty acids. There are essential amino acids and proteins. There are no essential carbohydrates. Even fiber, which, we could talk about whether that's beneficial or not, but let's say it is. Even fiber is not essential. Mm-hmm. In other words, you don't have to eat it to stay alive. But you do have to eat proteins and fats to stay alive. So where we got this misguided notion that we should be reducing fats as much as possible and increasing the carbohydrates that we don't even need, that was way off course like 50 years ago, and we're still stuck with that crappy model, and people won't give up on it.
We're still dealing with it, but these conversations make a dent in that. I want to know the difference between being in ketosis, fat adaptation, using ketones, exogenous ketones, and then keto adaptation, which is what you just referenced. Is there a difference in those three, and what is the difference?
Yeah, so we produce ketones all the time. You generally produce them at night when you're not eating, you'll produce ketones. So it's a natural state, but not at a very high rate because of our high carb diet in the West, typically. So when you don't, and this is part of the keto adaptation is changing your metabolism from one that's primarily sugar burning to one that's primarily fat burning. And so I like to think of it like a campfire. The sugar burning is like the kindling. And you can just keep throwing kindling on there all day, but it burns up pretty quickly and it burns too hot. Fats are kind of like that Presto log. You throw that on there and it'll go for, and you can only store like 3 or 4 hours worth of carbohydrate at maximum output, but you can store an infinite amount of fat, right? That's why we've had so much with elite athletes, with endurance athletes. Once they're fat adapted, they can go forever, right? Because it burns more efficiently too. So the process of switching from like a sugar burner to a fat burner doesn't happen like that. And some people it happens more quickly than others. Some people it takes typically a couple of days. Some people it takes a couple of weeks. Some people it even takes a couple of months before they're fully adapted. So we would recognize that as being in a state of nutritional ketosis when their normal blood ketone levels throughout the day are between at least 0.5 to 2 millimoles. That's the clinical range we use. So that's in a state of nutritional ketosis. In other words, there's no disease or nothing's happening bad. That's just your natural body state for ketones. The conventional wisdom in the clinic for your physician is that your ketones should be 0 because you should never be producing ketones except maybe when you're fasting a little bit, but the threshold there is very low. They don't want it to be very high at all. If it's over 1, it'll probably be flagged as being out of range. But
yeah, ketoacidosis, right? It's crazy.
Well, ketoacidosis. Now that's a dangerous, potentially fatal condition that happens in particular with diabetics that aren't controlled. That's very high. That's like over 10.
Yeah. And that's really a concern for type 1 diabetics. Really rare outside of that.
Yeah. I mean that is the potentially fatal, and that's the problem. Is people like me who teach medical students and so on when they're in their undergrad, we all teach them about ketoacidosis, and so there's so many people in the medical community that hear keto and they
associate it right away.
Bad. So you'll still get physicians that have reputations that should know better saying, it's dangerous because, you know, you could end up in ketoacidosis. You cannot end up in ketoacidosis through diet. You would have to have some sort of disease, which we would recognize, hopefully. So yeah, and then so there's also the, you know, ketogenic diets. There's different types. So that's, you'll probably hear me use the term well-formulated ketogenic diet, which is what my book Bio Diet is based on, is the clinical diet. And when I say clinical diet, don't think hospital food. It's really tasty, good food, but it's what we use because it's been designed specifically to maintain ketosis in our patient population. So it'll take a couple weeks. So I've got a guitar in the background. Do you play guitar?
I don't, no.
Well, if anybody who has out there, you know that if, you know, you got to fret and after a while you start getting calluses on your fingertips, right? Why do you get those calluses? Any sport, really, you know, tennis, golf, or whatever, you'll start to get calluses. Well, it doesn't happen like right away, but those are proteins, keratin that's being produced in response to a stimulation. So in our cells, there are proteins being produced that are part of the enzymatic pathway that allow that beta oxidation, that fat burning, the ketone production. And it doesn't happen right away. It takes a while to stimulate those genes to produce the proteins to have the effect. And that's the keto adaptation phase. And during that phase, it generally takes a couple of weeks. You know, you should see your blood ketones would rise. But at the same time, you know, you get there by really restricting carbohydrate. And when you restrict carbohydrate, other things change in your body. First of all, the carbohydrate stored in your muscles and in your liver in particular is glycogen. And glycogen, it stores about 4 times as much of its weight in water. So obviously when you remove the glucose from your system, by not eating it, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to go to the stores in your liver. You're going to pull that out, and water is going to come out with it. And so you're going to pee out that water. You're going to burn the glucose. So you're going to have a diuretic effect. So, and this is why people say, oh yeah, well, when you go on a ketogenic diet, it's just water loss. That's all it is. Well, for the first 2 weeks, it probably is mostly water loss. But then after that, once you're burning fat, you will burn typically 1 to 2 pounds of fat per week. And that's why we typically see in 12 weeks, you know, and you probably see this 10 to 15 pounds for women, 20, 25 pounds for men of fat, like comes right up. And we can do DEXA, you know, to show that it's actually fat that's happening. So that happens. But also, and here's another thing about insulin that most people don't know. Insulin also makes you reabsorb sodium from your kidneys. So in other words, it's not going in your urine, it's being reabsorbed from what would go into your urine and put back in your blood. Sodium is salt. Where salt goes, it will make things more concentrated. So our body responds by storing more water in the blood, and that can drive your blood pressure up. Yeah. Right. So blood pressure is directly, there's something called Poiseuille's law. It's directly proportional to blood volume. So if you have high insulin, you're going to have high sodium retention, high blood volume, high blood pressure. So what happens when you're on a ketogenic diet in the first couple of weeks, your blood pressure can drop dramatically. So if you have hypertension, you actually, you know, this is why you need to talk to your physician. You might have to have a concomitant reduction in those antihypertensive drugs to prevent your blood pressure from going too low. You're right. So, you know, people have had blood pressure that's too high for decades. All of a sudden, their blood pressure is regulating again. Their blood sugar is regulating again. And just to relate back to the studies we're doing too, we say the same changes consistently in that very ill population of women with metastatic breast cancer, the same changes as we see in elite athletes. In other words, the effect, the positive benefit of a ketogenic diet works just as well for really ill people as it does for really healthy people. Awesome. And it does improve the body composition. So you lose body fat for sure. Your insulin resistance improves. Your inflammation goes down. And all the other kind of health benefits. I'm sure you've talked about metabolic disease before, right? Which is a combination of, you know, the dyslipidemia, the fats get out of whack, the increased blood sugar, the waist size increases and blood pressure goes up. And that's really, to me, that's the thing exactly that ketogenic diet treats, is that metabolic disease, which will then lead to all these other comorbidities.
So powerful. And I know you've done several studies, clinical studies. I want to talk about one of them. You did a 6-month controlled study where share a little bit more about how that study worked and some of the outcomes that you saw from it.
Yeah, it's just going to press. So I don't want to give away all our. Well, part of it is also one of the researchers, Ryan Dickerson. It's part of his research for his PhD thesis. So I don't want to say too much about that. But I can tell you, you know, first we found, I mean, we had a number of different questions. So this is a 12-week intervention for women with metastatic breast cancer. So it's stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. Essentially, the medical community has done all they can for these women, and so they're very ill. And so because they don't want the ketogenic diet to be confusing any other experimental drugs or whatever, that's the patient population we work with. So they're very motivated, but we put them on a ketogenic diet, and we've had great success with them staying on it. They are now I should some of the caveats. It's not a homogeneous group. There are different types of breast cancer, and there's single, double, triple positive. They're on different medications, the standard of care, usually Xeloda or Taxol, aromatase inhibitors, those sorts of things. So they are on drugs, and we then provide this intervention. And what we've seen over so we do initial blood draws, and we do initial imaging. So it's the first clinical use of a PET CT scan. So we're imaging the tumor mass itself. We're doing blood draws. We're doing daily draws of blood finger prick for ketones to make sure they're in ketosis. We feed them all of the food. We provide the food for them. So we know exactly what they're eating. So we know what the composition of that diet is. And so what we're seeing after 6 weeks, we do more of the measurements plus DEXA. So we know the body fat composition. Then we do it again. They go free living after that. So they learn how to cook for themselves, make meals and all that. And then we measure them again at 12 weeks. And so this, I would have to say, anecdotally speaking, we see significant improvements. First of all, there were no adverse effects. So none of the women in the study had any adverse effects that were related to the ketogenic diet. So first, do no harm, right? We wanted to be sure that was the case. Secondly, and perhaps most profoundly that we can say, is the ketogenic diet had the same effect on these women as it does in a normal, healthy population. So a very positive effect in terms of body composition and blood glucose and insulin levels and insulin resistance. All those things change for the positive. And so they're in better health. Yeah. So, and so one would presume that would mean you would have a healthier immune system and immune function, and perhaps that would help to reduce tumor mass. We did see reduction in tumor masses and tumor markers throughout the study. And it was pretty consistent, not everyone, not all the time. And again, there are different types of cancer with different cell types and so on. But so I would say this is emerging science, and that it indicates that there is very positive therapeutic benefit to a well-formulated ketogenic diet as a concomitant treatment. In other words, along with the standard of care. So there are no studies, although there are anecdotal things out there on the internet. Sometimes tumors spontaneously resolve. So you have cancer, it's going to kill you, and all of a sudden it's gone. That's probably it's almost surely your immune system is suddenly becoming activated to that. We have other clinical studies that show that there is an increase in the positive immune effects, anti-cancer, anti-tumor immune effects. In a previous study, we also saw that in this study. So some of there's called cytokines and chemokines. These are kind of like cell communications for white cells and other elements of your innate immune system. We're seeing an upregulation of the ones that are anti-tumor. So there may be a mechanism by which those tumors are reduced. The patient study is only 13, so it's very small. Yeah. But one woman just cancer went away. So was that the diet? I don't know. It didn't hurt. She's certainly better. And we don't follow them up after the 12 weeks. That's part of the ethics thing. So we don't know what happened after that. But yeah, imagine that, where you're told to go home and get your affairs in order, and 6 weeks, and this is 6 weeks later, the tumors are all gone.
It's amazing. Yeah, and
as I say, the medical community giving up. So yeah, I do get lots of emails and stuff from people. I'm happy to address them when I can, but I do want to emphasize again, you need to do this. If you're going to do this, you need to talk to your physician about it. It might be contraindicated for reasons I also mentioned in the book. And you need to tell your oncologist this is what you're doing. I think it will start, it is being used in more and more places as a concomitant treatment for cancer. But again, going back to the top of our discussion, it's a really good way to prevent it. Excuse me.
And that's the key, prevention. That's what we want to do. A lot of people listening are probably listening and watching for prevention. So it's perfect.
Yeah. And and if you're not a keto fan, you're going to say, well, we don't have enough research to show that it causes prevention. I go, well, there's not enough money on the planet to do that experiment, because we would need tens of thousands of people. We'd have to actually buy and feed them food for 30 years and see what the rates of cancer are and one against the other. We're just never going to do that.
Yeah.
But what we can do is see how ketogenic diets work as a therapeutic for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, and now for cancer, and even some other conditions we could talk about, neurological conditions and so on. So if it has a positive effect once you have the disease, it would follow have a positive effect in preventing the disease in the first place. And as I say, if you're correcting the metabolic issue that leads to chronic disease, and then you're also stimulating the innate immune system to be more vigilant against cancer, then yeah, I think it's the best lifestyle choice that anyone can make. But the caveat, it's not for everyone. Ketogenic diets work pretty well with about 7 out of 8 people, and there's about 1 out of 8 people it doesn't work. There's a very, very small percentage of people that have genetic disorders. They can't metabolize ketones properly and so on, for which it would be contraindicated. And then, there's other conditions. So, pregnancy, breastfeeding, you need to discuss that with your physician. But for the, 88% of American adults are overweight or obese.
I know. Oh.
So that's our target audience, Ben. Those are the people we're trying to help. And if you consider 7 out of 8 of them are probably going to really benefit from a ketogenic diet, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
I have to give a shout out to my friends, and Jeff Bullock's involved, and Dr. Stephen Finney, and Sarah Hallberg until she passed away sadly at Virta. Virta is doing, their goal is to get 100 million people to reverse diabetes. So to reverse diabetes in 100 million people, that's their goal. And they're on pace. Like, they are helping that. Their system is, they get paid by the insurers, the health insurers. And if it doesn't work, they don't get paid.
Yeah.
And they're just having amazing results. We now have 5-year data coming out of them showing amazing results. 90+% of people can reduce the need for diabetic medication and type 2 diabetes. 64-65% long-term complete reversal. In other words, as long as they stay on the diet, they don't need drugs at all.
It's amazing. Yeah.
And right now, the spending hundreds of billions a year treating diabetes. Yeah. The estimate is that by 2030 in the US alone, by 2030, which is not that far away now, the US will be spending $660 billion just treating type 2 diabetes at present rates, which is, to put that in context, it's about the same as the defense budget is in 2022.
It's crazy.
For a disease that didn't really exist 100 years ago,
right,
in significant numbers.
Right. Yeah, that's absurd. We do have work to do, and Virta is doing incredible work. You're right. Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about the lipid panel. A lot of people who do keto, they're increasing their healthy fats. Hopefully, it's the healthy fats, not the bad fats. What are some of the things you've seen trends with HDL, LDL? Maybe if you could unpack a little bit HDL, LDL, triglycerides, and the full picture, also looking at CRP and other inflammatory markers to get a good idea. Because the common question I get on my YouTube channel, on my YouTube videos, is I started to do keto and my total cholesterol went up and my doctor wants me to stop, or my doctor wants me to go on a statin solely on the total cholesterol. So can we get a good idea of why there's more moving parts and pieces to the puzzle than just total cholesterol?
Yeah. Sure. I can tell you what my opinion is. I'm not a physician, right? So I don't really interpret. And by the way, if people do want to get in touch with me, I can't, treat cancer. That's not what I do. I can help you with diet. But, I get people, they give me their whole medical history and that sort of thing, which is fine. But I can't comment on our, clinical studies. I can tell you, what things you want to measure. So in terms of the lipid panel, so there's the cholesterol they measure. There's total cholesterol, and they're not named well, but the so-called bad cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, which is low density lipoprotein. It's not actually cholesterol itself, it's the protein carrier that includes that. Then there's the high density lipoprotein, which is so-called good cholesterol. So the general, very, very general thing is you want less of the LDL and more of the HDL. And so it's actually the ratio between those two that are pretty good. And they've been trying to work on drugs. They have statins that lower your LDL. They've been trying to work on drugs to raise HDL for decades, and they can't make it work.
Right.
But 3 things improve HDL. One is exercise. Two is alcohol. So part of the well-formulated ketogenic diet is you can, have a glass of wine or even two a day if you're a guy, and you don't have alcoholism in your family. You're not going to be operating machinery or driving a car, all that. So those caveats. But alcohol is probably a pretty good thing. And the third one is saturated fats. And so on a ketogenic, we're not afraid of saturated fats. There's no relationship between saturated fat in the diet and cardiovascular disease. That just was never really existed. They thought maybe, but no, it's actually got a lot more to do with how much sugar you have in your diet. And you talk about good fats and bad fats. In terms of the diet, what you want to avoid are those vegetable oils and any trans fats, hydrogenated vegetable oils. Those are really bad for you. So animal like lard is great. Butter, especially if it's from grass-fed cows, because that's high in omega-3, so that's great. I mean, I eat tons of that stuff. This is my tea. My tea is with whipping cream, right? It's full fat cream. I get fat wherever I can. And I get my blood work done all the time. Doesn't do anything. So if you have a diet, the other thing that changes with ketogenic diets, your triglycerides, which are the actual circulating fats, that goes way down because that's what you're burning now. That's your fuel. So you're burning that regularly. So you take it out of your blood, and you also take it out of your fat stores. So that's why you lose fat on a ketogenic diet.
If somebody's just to cut you off real quick, if somebody's doing a lot of those like fatty coffees, fatty teas, how long should they stop that before a blood test for triglycerides? If they had that like within 12 hours, will it show up on that triglyceride blood test?
No. I'd say the fasting, so you can't. I mean, if you load it up with saturated fat and went and did a test right after that, but a fasting test, you should be fine. A few hours, it'll be gone. So we see that, and then what the lipoproteins do is they're basically fat carriers. And so if you're burning fats now, it's kind of like they're transporter trucks. So for a lot of people, they'll get an increase in LDL. These are the transport trucks taking the fat from fat stores to be burned in the cells. But there's different particle sizes and numbers in there. And so the light, fluffy kind of LDL doesn't correlate with cardiovascular disease. It's the small particle stuff that does. And you don't get small particle LDL when you're in ketosis, but you do get lots of the light fluffy stuff. So your LDL goes up, and in about a third of, like mine is in range, but in about a third of women, because most of who I work with are women that are postmenopausal, they'll see an increase in LDL that'll be out of range. If it's isolated, that's a different thing than if it's associated with low HDL, high triglycerides, high blood pressure, and so on. Right. But if it's just that one number, we don't really know, other than what I've already explained, why that would increase in some people and not others, and whether there's a health risk to that particular, like having too much light, fluffy LDL in your system. We don't know the cellular mechanism. I don't think anybody has studies on that. What the medical people usually refer to as FH, familial hypercholesteremia, which are very young. It's a gene, and you have way too much cholesterol, and that kind of irritates the lining. So these are people that have heart attacks in their 30s and so on. And that's kind of what they go on, is if you have too much LDL for too long, you're going to get atherosclerosis. We don't know about people that are, postmenopausal, women with just high LDL. So the HDL goes up and the LDL goes up. So of course your total cholesterol goes up, and it'll be off outside of range. But the ratio of the two is what's important. And perhaps, and there is quite a bit of evidence now, the better marker is the ratio of HDL and triglycerides. Yeah. So you want the HDL to be high and the triglycerides to be low. And if that's the case, then what are you treating with a statin just to lower the LDL? You can also do a coronary calcium score to see, the state of your, which is probably a good thing to do if you can do it. And in some cases, if you can get an angiogram to see if your arteries are clean. And my wife and co-author, Dale Drury, she's an example because she had an aortic valve replacement just recently. So her LDL is the only thing. Her LDL is really high. Everything else is gold standard, absolutely off the charts. And she had an angiogram completely clean, coronary calcium score 0. So we just don't know at this point. And so, it's all sample size of 1. But so it's complicated, but it is not unusual to see LDL to rise, especially in postmenopausal women. And you can knock that back with a statin, but statins have side effects, and you have to measure that yourself. It would be great if we had, I've been looking for it, but it doesn't exist yet, long-term studies on the effect of isolated LDL on cardiovascular disease, and that data doesn't exist. So again, something to discuss with your physician, but remember, your physician has to follow the standard of care, which is if LDL is too high, put people on a statin.
Right. Yeah. And typically they're just measuring total LDL. And to your point, there's different particle sizes. So if you're getting, I like a test called the NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, which is splitting up those particles, small and sticky, large and fluffy. And then that gives you more of an accurate measurement. But even with that, you also want to look at the other markers, HDL and triglycerides, and get that ratio. And then also maybe your inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein and homocysteine and fasting insulin, and then get a full picture. And then you could make more of an educated decision. A lot of people jump to the gun because the doctor and very powerful lab coat tells you, your total LDL and total LDL and cholesterol is up. This is a problem. This keto is not working for you, but there's so many other moving parts. So I hope this empowers you to have a better conversation with your doctor and request those other markers, and then you could make a better decision.
Or just ask, what if it's just the LDL and everything else is great? And by the way, we should add, your blood pressure is fine, and obesity or whatever. So
you're losing weight, you feel better.
Then what you're suggesting, and that's I talk about all the different tests. I show the book here in the bio diet. Is what it looks like there. And I got an egg on there because that's like nature's perfect food, right? So
yesterday I had like 8 of them. I'm doing carnivore. Eggs have been a staple for me right now.
Well, and the cholesterol in the eggs is not going to affect the cholesterol in your system. It's you produce that in your liver, as needed, but. So there's still lots of questions to answer about it, but we're not seeing negative health effects. And by the way, there was a study out recently, I believe it was Dr. Ludwig as well, looking at carnivores, because there's enough people doing carnivore and not seeing adverse effects for people on carnivore diets. I don't think it's too long term. I think it's like 6-month window or something like that.
Yeah.
No, none of those expected. You're going to die of cardiovascular disease if you're eating meat all the time. No, and actually the study just out, a Danish study yesterday, looking at not just meat, but also processed meat, looking at all of the evidence that is related to cancer, basically saying there's none of that is robust or convincing. And I think you should probably limit the processed meat, and like wieners and stuff, that's not really meat. I don't know what it is, but you don't need to be afraid of chicken, pork, beef, and fish, and eat all you want, and eat all the fat. It's not gonna hurt you. Now, you can't do that if you're also gonna drink soda pop that's full of sugar, because you don't want to do that. In the absence of the carbohydrate, all that stuff will probably improve your health if you're eating a standard American diet, that SAD diet.
I did an experiment a couple of years ago with carnivore where I did 40 days straight of carnivore. And on day 1, I did a full lab panel, very comprehensive, where I did my C-reactive protein, HSCRP, thyroid panel, fasting insulin, lipid particles, a complete lipid panel. And then, of course, I did 40 days to see how I felt. And I felt incredible. And I was already doing keto and kind of doing keto flexing, where I go in and out of ketosis. But then my results went to another level. I just felt better, brain felt better, skin complexion improved. And then on day 40, I did the whole panel again, the same panel, before I broke my carnivore. And all of these markers improved. Like my C-reactive protein was already pretty good. It was 1.1, and then it dropped 0.5 after 40 days of carnivore. Homocysteine went from, I think, 8.0 to 5 point something. So that dropped a couple points. My fasting insulin dropped a little bit. My LDL did go up, right? But everything else improved, and my HDL went up with it. So it was a great experiment for me. That's just my personal experiment. So now from time to time, a couple times per year, sometimes 3 times per year, I'll do 30 to 40 days of carnivore. So I'm doing it right now, June, with a lot of my Keto Camp Academy students, and I feel awesome with carnivore personally.
And a lot of people report. I haven't tried it myself, but I'm not averse to it at all. But actually, what you're describing is pretty typical of not just carnivore, but the ketogenic diets in general. It's that improvement. And so, but we should also emphasize the fact that diet does need to be personalized. Everybody reacts to foods differently on an individual basis, which is why I always tell people don't do this at home on your own based on a YouTube video or whatever. That like your keto camp, you need to get. You will get the best results if you have the best education about how to safely adopt a ketogenic diet and how to maintain it, sustain it, and you need to get a little bit of coaching. So there are lots of not so much dietitians because they're kind of regulated, but there's lots of nutritionists and there's folks like yourself with Keto Camp that can provide that. And that's kind of why, I mean, the reason I wrote BioDiet was so that people would have the clinically established evidence. And so the first half of that book tells you why we're in the mess we're in, why ketogenic diets. It's really pretty much a reiteration of our conversation this morning. The second is like the 5 steps. Here's how you do it. Here's, first you get all those measurements like you did. It was the right thing, talk to your physician. Then you just a little ease into it, and then you do the keto adaptation, and then you go for the 12 weeks, and then you decide what to do at the end of that. Is it working for you or not? And it's all very safe and laid out. And it's not a recipe book though. It's not like a cookbook. It's a how-to and a why-to, and that I think empowers people to continue. So in our one of our clinical results, we developed this model for coaching people clinically, which would probably be interesting. We call it the Moses model. And Moses is an acronym, like MOSES. So it's motivation. So usually people come to keto because they want to lose weight, 95% plus, which is great. You lose weight, but as you and I were saying, we're much more interested in improving your metabolic health.
Yes.
But that's your motivation. Opportunity, we're providing you the opportunity. You got Keto Camp, you got my book, you got, there's more and more keto restaurants opening up. You have the opportunity now. Don't wait till it's broken to try and fix it. The best thing to do is to prevent it from happening in the first place. So start today. If you got a wedding on the weekend, maybe wait till after the wedding, and you're going to eat a lot. But start soon. Sooner's better. And then, so that's the motivation, the opportunity, and then the support. So you need to have support from people like you, from me, from the book, from your family, from your friends, to let them know what you're doing and why. And don't try and break me down and tell me it's wrong and it's crazy and it's a fad, And then E is for education, which again we're trying to do with your Keto Camp, with my book. And then the last one is sustainability. So that's the Moses, is sustainability, and that's the trickiest one. I mean, I talked to a lot of people say, oh yeah, I tried keto, it didn't work. And first of all, I don't know what they were eating, and I don't know what they meant by keto. And because a lot of people just take carbs out of their diet, but they don't increase the fat.
Yeah.
So then they're just in calorie restriction, and that'll lower your metabolic rate, and that's why it doesn't work. Because you've lowered your metabolic rate, you've biased your body to storing fat. So you have to get the right methodology first, educate yourself first, and then go into it. And that's your ticket to success. But I don't know how long you've been keto, a long time. I think we're past 10 years now, my wife and I. And I'm seeing, I mean, keto as a research thing, it really took off around early 2000s in terms of the research world. So now it's, for example, you talked about your skin condition. I think a lot of young people don't know that, particularly women, because it's PCOS is polycystic ovarian syndrome. That is a insulin resistance condition, which can be treated with ketogenic diet. And when you do, your complexion will clear up too.
Yeah.
One of the best ways to clear up bad complexion is through a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, so many benefits to it. And your book is a great resource. I think it's also a great resource for somebody who could share the research in your book to their doctor, or even give the doctor the book. And maybe you could review this and see if this is a good approach for me. And your book's available over at biodiet.org.
Yeah, biodiet.org.
Yeah, ORG. I'll put it down. I'll put the link down below. And then it's also available on Audible. And you did it with your wife, right? It was co-narrated with your wife. Yeah.
So if you like my kind of high-pitched nasal voice, my wife and I, she's got a nice sultry voice, but we read it ourselves. Yeah. So and yeah, all the formats. You can get the hard copy, I should say, which is soft cover, or audiobook or ebook. All the online internet sales, all that sort of thing. It's available through the website biodiet.org. And there's also, if I can mention, in there at the top of the page, there's a little link, resources. And in those resources, and I have a lot of the podcasts and video and stuff that I've done too, but all of the figures that are in the book are in there. The shopping list, the grocery shopping list is in there. You don't have to give me your email or anything. You can just go and download that yourself. And then there's a whole bunch of other information, like all of the science, but I don't have them listed as the primary sources because it's hard. It's pretty dense for a lot of people, the cellular molecular stuff. So it's as reported in the secondary media sources, like Medscape and those sorts of presentations. So it's links to those, and then that will link to the primary studies if you want to look at those. But we've got it categorized, and if you look on there, there's probably, I don't know, 30 different categories for which ketogenic diets have benefits, right? All the different disease conditions. So if your viewers and your listeners have a particular condition, they can go on to that resources thing and they can find the evidence that supports the therapeutic use of a ketogenic diet for that particular condition.
That's fantastic. So it's biodiet.org to find that. We'll put a link down below. Anywhere else you want to send them, David?
Yeah, they can go to Keto Chow. If they go to, I guess it's Keto Salt Lake. So go to Keto Salt Lake. You can put my name in or Ben's name in. We're right after each other. There's sort of one continuous one, then they have the individual ones. The other one that I think people might benefit from, since we're not through COVID yet, is I presented last year. So again, if you go to Keto Salt Lake 2021 with my name, with Harper or whatever.
On YouTube, by the way. You're talking about YouTube, right?
Yeah, it's YouTube that it's on there. Yeah, but they can Google it and find it there that way too. But it's I go through the science that supports the potential benefits of a ketogenic diet for COVID. So in other words, preventing it from taking hold. If it take hold, how it benefits your immune system in terms of getting. And there's it's a really good paper by Janelle Ayers a while back that sort of summarized that. But I've summarized a lot of the data around, and it's just because we haven't done the experiment, so it's just hypothetical. But if you look at all the ways in which ketogenic diets affect your immune system, it should, in theory, have tremendous benefit to protect you from that. And maybe best of all is the people that have the worst outcomes are the people that are in poor metabolic health.
Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah.
So if you get yourself in good metabolic health, then your resistance is, we know for a fact that you're going to have a better outcome, right?
That's
So
exactly it.
just that alone, but then there's all these cellular molecular ones. So you can have a look at those two. The one I did this year, it's a cancer one, the ketogenic one. They'd probably get, they'll be sick of me by then, but it's all there for.
I'll have Rachel, she does our podcast notes. Rachel is going to put the Keto Salt Lake lecture that David did on cancer this year. We'll put the link down below, the one a year ago on the immune system, and then my lecture will be. So everything's down below for those watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast. We'll put it down below. Just click it and you could watch it today. Last question for you is, what are you grateful for today, David?
I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you, to talk to your listeners and viewers, that I discovered ketogenic diet so my wife and I can live a happier, healthier life. And grateful just for the opportunity to share that what I've discovered as a scientist with people, not through scientific literature or having to take my courses, but through avenues like what you provided, so they can hear and learn of the benefits, and get on with it as soon as possible. And you will live a happier, healthier life if you pursue this. And please send me. They can. My email is on the website there too. They can email me if they have any questions for follow up. But yeah, what are you grateful for?
Well, I love what you shared. I'm grateful that we had this conversation. It was so valuable. There's so many things in my notes that I still wanted to get to. So we'll do round 2 later this year. So I'm grateful that we have the technology and the research to have conversations like this that I believe give people a lot of hope, and the research to back up why we believe they should give this a shot and customize it, of course, to their unique needs. So I'm grateful that we had this conversation. I'm grateful that it was a nice sunny day and I played some basketball earlier today before it started to rain. And I'm grateful that my dog is sleeping right here next to me. So many things to be grateful for today.
Yeah.
David, I want to acknowledge you for the work that you're doing. I think it's amazing. I love how committed you are. You would make your mom very proud with the research you're doing and all the people you're helping and all the people you're preventing from getting not just breast cancer, but cancer overall. So thank you for what you're doing. We'll do round 2 and keep up the great work, my friend.
I'll look forward to that, my friend.